gives me real privilege and honor to invite our next guest. He is the Right Honourable Paddy Ashdown. He's had an illustrious career, as you know. I won't mention everything, we'll be here all day. He served as a Royal Marines officer throughout the world. He was, of course, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, and he served in international mediation in the Balkans. So please give a warm round of applause to Paddy Ashdown.
Well, Dr. Abdullah, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here. I'm going to be giving you an oversight, perhaps that will inform the discussion today, which goes wider than just Saudi Arabia. I'll naturally be giving you a viewpoint which is essentially a Western viewpoint. For this, please forgive me. And of course, as your introducer said earlier on, this is a contentious area, so I fear I won't be able to say things which are universally popular to everybody. But as a liberal, I've been used to that all my life. I first visited the Middle East back in 1959, when, if I recall properly, in the Gulf, the currency was the Princess Maria Theresa dollar still, how things have changed since those days. And so I want to really look at this, this interest that I've had in the Islamic world, which of course eventually got reflected in the work I did as High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Has really been something that's been with me all my life. Forgive me if what I'm about to say is a Western perspective. I remember when I first went to the Middle East, there used to be a saying that if a dog barked in the Middle East, British intelligence was behind it. One of the problems is that we in the West still view the Middle East in those ways. In foreign affairs, having a flawed model for viewing the world is nearly always the prelude to having flawed policies which end in failure. The West, it seems to me now, cannot shake itself from the view that we still rule the world, as we have done these last 400 years, since, by the way, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire. So we think that everything that happens in the world is about us. The things that are important in the world are only important because they affect us. And anywhere there's a problem in the world, we can solve it. It's no longer like this. And I think one of the things that has to happen is the West has to wake up and understand. There were many, many casualties in the wars of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. But one of them was the myth of Western omnipotence and the utility of having a purely Western-centric view of all that happens in the world. For 4 years now, perhaps a bit longer, many of us have been warning that the greatest threat to world peace coming from the Middle East was not, as we viewed it, jihadist terrorism, but rather the danger of a wider Sunni-Shia religious conflict, similar to the wars of religion which engulfed Europe in the 17th century. And that the terrorist insurgencies in Iraq, Syria, Mali, Yemen, Lebanon, and the wider world of Islam should not, we argued, be seen as individual conflicts, but as part of and preludes to this larger confrontation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The radicalization of the Sunni Ummah, promoted, assisted, and funded, I regret to say, by Saudi Arabian and Gulf elements, though not necessarily their governments, though it's my view that if their governments had wanted to stop that, they could have done, is not any longer targeted on us in the West, as we sometimes like to believe. Its real target is, I pose, not the great Satan in Washington, but the great heretic in Tehran. Attacks on Washington, London, Madrid are merely a proxy to help win support for that wider conflict. I know it is hurtful, strangely, paradoxically, to Western pride to think that these attacks on our cities are merely collateral damage. It is difficult to accept that we're not the main event here. We're just the hors d'oeuvre. But that is how it is. Of course, this is not to diminish the threat to us here in London or to suggest that we should not have been taking this seriously. Terrorist in the name of jihad is a real and present threat to us. Collateral casualties are no less casualties, as the innocents of Yemen, Iraq, and Syria know so miserably well. The casualties of the bomb outrages in Western cities and the dead from the indiscriminate bombing of crowded suburbs in Sana'a are victims of the same event. The struggle between Sunni and Shia, which now stands, it seems to me, right on the edge of breaking into open conflict. A word for a moment, if I may, about the role of religion in these kind of conflicts. Of course, I do not in any way doubt the sincerity of those who feel deeply, sometimes even violently, about the differences between the two great branches of Islam. I have personal experience of these kind of hates in Northern Ireland and in Bosnia. These sentiments may be odious, but amongst most ordinary people, they are, I'm sad to say, sincerely felt. My quarrel lies less with the misguided individuals who feel driven to be the actors in these tragedies than it does with those behind them who use religion to drive the conflict. The reality is that in almost all great so-called religious conflicts, and I think the one we see developing in the Middle East is no different, what lies behind the shouting of the clerics is a contest between the power of nations. It was surely obvious to any sharp-eyed observer with any knowledge of the Middle East that the moment that matters in the region ceased to be determined in the capitals of the great Western powers, a contest of who was up and who was down would be bound to ensue. And that contest was likely to be, as we now see it, between Riyadh and Tehran. And the vehicle, motivator, and driver for that contest would be religion, just as it was in Europe in the 17th century, just as it has been in so many conflicts that I have been involved in, from the Far East to Northern Ireland to Bosnia. This particular contest of power has, for those of us with eyes sharp enough to see it, been a long time coming. It has been building up strength, followers, and causes through the proxy wars in Iraq and Syria, the proxy insurgencies in Mali, Libya, and Yemen, and the proxy terrorist outrages of major Western capitals. Left unchecked, as it has been, there was always going to be a moment when this would turn from something behind the scenes and below the surface to something open and right in front of us. The sudden seriousness with which Washington has woken up to what has happened recently in Lebanon, having been so completely asleep to what was happening in Yemen, seems to indicate that that moment is very near. So why should this bother us in Britain? Haven't we got enough on our plate with our own war with the European Union? Is it not just another faraway country in the shameful worlds of Chamberlain, of which we need to know little? No, it is definitely not. A regional conflict between Riyadh and Tehran, should one break out, fired by religious contention, is already sowing, as we have seen, little wars around the region. If this finally breaks into something which directly engages the two contesting capitals, then I think we would see a threat to the wider peace of at least the same magnitude as the tensions surrounding North Korea, especially if, as seems certain, Israel becomes involved. Mao Zedong famously called the two great world wars of the last century the European civil wars. It is not an inaccurate or inappropriate description, for it reminds us that in our deeply interconnected world, regional conflicts can have global consequences. 3 years ago, I suggested that the right way to view the conflicts in Syria and Iraq were through the Sunni-Shia prism, that the wars in Syria and Iraq could neither be solved nor ended by high explosive alone, that what we needed was a Dayton-style international treaty safeguarding existing borders, that this should involve the regional players across the Sunni-Shia divide and be underpinned by Russia, the US, and Europe, acting as guarantor powers, that Russia at that time had too much interest in the area because of Sunni radicalism in their own Islamic republics not to join a wider coalition to destroy so-called ISIL. That if this did not happen, Moscow would inevitably, unilaterally be drawn in to support Tehran and to suppress with bombs what they did not have the opportunity to contain with international diplomacy. That what would follow would be a deepening of local conflicts and a heightening of Riyadh-Tehran tensions. That the West would get dragged in to support one side and Russia would get dragged in to support the other. And that this would, in the end, fire up a regional conflict in the Middle East which would have global consequences. It gives me no pleasure whatsoever to say that this is exactly what has now happened. We are very close to a Sunni-Shia conflict with great power involvement on opposite sides. If that does not strike a shiver down your back, then you have not spent enough time studying history. As I learnt in both Northern Ireland and Bosnia, the lesson is that even though it is necessary constantly to press for peace, of course it is, peace in the end cannot be achieved until the warring parties are willing and the right external conditions are in place. The right context, I argue, may be the only context for a sustainable peace in Yemen, Lebanon, and elsewhere in the Middle East is some kind of accommodation between Riyadh and Tehran. I do not know whether this late in the game this is any longer possible. I do not know whether, having been so deeply invested on the ground, President Putin would see it any longer in his interest to play a constructive role in the process. I do not know whether President Trump, who seems incapable of resisting any opportunity for a dogfight, has the strategic vision to see that this kind of diplomatic engagement is in Washington's interest. I do not know whether Brussels, now so internally obsessed with its own problems, is able to expend energy and political will on anything else. But I'm pretty certain that absent this kind of vision and engagement, what has been these last 2 decades an extremely turbulent Middle East could, if the Sunni-Shia contest continues, quickly become something even more dangerous, something which Mao Zedong would have recognized very well, a regional conflict which would threaten the wider peace. I'm afraid to say there is much about the piles of tinder scattered around the Middle East today which reminds me of the Balkans in 1914. So what should the policies of the Western nations be to this impending danger? If it is the case, as I think it is, that the greatest danger to world peace coming out of the Middle East at present is not jihadist terrorism, but an open regional war between the imperial ambitions of Saudi Arabia and Iran, then the right policy for Western nations is scrupulously not to take sides. We should have good, normal relations with countries across the divide and treat them exactly the same. If they sponsor terrorism, we should strongly oppose their policies by all means possible, rather than, as we too frequently do, turn a blind eye to them for short-term convenience. If they engage in proxy conflicts, we should not throw fuel on the fire by supporting one side against the other, above all with weapons. If they commit war crimes, we should condemn this even-handedly. We should strive, in short, by every means possible to encourage dialogue and agreement and take care to take no steps which will deepen the divide between both sides. We should, above all, avoid any move which propels events further down the track we are already far advanced on, where the West supports one side and Russia takes up arms in support of the other. This is the outcome of greatest danger, and we are, in my view, very, very close to it. So now we come to Britain and Saudi Arabia, especially in the context of the rolling tragedy in Yemen. From a moral point of view, Britain's support of Saudi Arabia's actions in Yemen with arms is as foolish as it is reprehensible. It is very clear that war crimes have been committed in the conflict in Yemen, both in relation to indiscriminate attacks on civilians and by using aid and starvation as a weapon of war. Britain's silence on these matters is thunderous and shaming. You see, the fact that we are at the same time supplying arms to Saudi Arabia makes it even more so. The government tells us that no weapons supplied by Britain have been used in this war. I have to say to you, as someone who knows a little about the temptations and confusions of war, I simply do not believe this. The government should announce an immediate suspension of arms sales to Riyadh until the blockade of aid supplies is lifted and the indiscriminate bombing of civilians has been brought to a close. I know enough of these kind of conflicts to understand that crimes are likely to be committed by both sides in these kind of dirty wars. I'm sure that it is true that the Houthi rebels in Yemen are also guilty of using aid and hunger as a weapon of war. But the difference is that they are not our allies. We do not support them, whereas Riyadh is an ally and one to whom we supply weapons of war. I am not, ladies and gentlemen, so naive as not to understand there are other factors involved here. Trade at a time when, thanks to the folly of Brexit, we have a desperate urgency to grow our foreign trade quickly. Assistance in the struggle against terror, which far too often causes us to turn a convenient blind eye to human rights abuses in those countries which are our allies. Maintaining the balance in the Middle East broadly favourable to the West. The threat of the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the regions. I understand all those complexities, but I doubt whether bending our principles in favour of short-term advantage on all these fronts will deliver anything of use to us in the long term. But even if it were so, even if it were to be that such hopeful outcomes, if and when they do arrive, then they would have long ago been blotted out by the horrors of a widening religious war into which the great powers of our day allow themselves to be dragged in support of one side or another. That is the danger, it seems to me, that now confronts us, and it is time that the world states, men and women, should wake up and realize it. If this conference of yours helps to make that case and helps to make that understood, it will have served a very important purpose. Thank you very much indeed. I'm very happy to try and answer some questions if there are any, ladies and gentlemen.
I was just about to say that we only have Lord Paddy Ashdown for 10 minutes, so he's happy to take questions. Yeah. At the front here, this gentleman there.
Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. Thank you, Lord Ashdown, for your presentation. What hopes do you think, with the Crown Prince, the new MBS, are there for Saudi Arabia? I mean, myself, I've been a critic of Saudi Arabia in the past, but for the first time we see a member of the monarchy in a key position willing to introduce reforms. And I think it's really great that he's actually dealing with corruption within the royal family. So do you think there is hope now that we're going to see a sea change in terms of reforms? I mean, women driving, education, and there are reservations, of course. I mean, Yemen, which you've mentioned.
I think you know about this more than I do. I, like you, can see some hopeful signs. When I was in Bosnia, I was asked to differentiate. The West has a terrible habit of sort of picking their friends, particularly if their friends happen to have gone to Sandhurst with them, as is the case with many seniors in the Conservative Party. And I've always found that was a very bad policy. I judge people by what they do. And so I'd like to wait and see. But the early signs, as you say, are good. And that is good for Saudi Arabia, if indeed they are carried through with sincerity and with political will. So in that sense, yes, I'm hopeful. But what I want to see, if I can, is not just somebody who recognizes the reforms that need to be made. It's a Saudi Arabian matter, I don't want to interfere in it, but the reforms that need to be made domestically, but also has the strategic view to see that it is in no one's interest to see a confrontation between Riyadh and Tehran break out in the Middle East. No one will benefit from that. And so if he delivers on what he appears to be approaching domestically, I welcome that. But I hope he'll do more than that. If he's a great leader, he will be able to see that the strategic issues in that area, in the Middle East, are today at least as important, and probably for the wider peace of the world more important. And I hoped he'd have that vision too.
There's a question at the front, Claire Schultz.
Thank you, Paddy. I think it's very unlikely indeed that there'll be an all-out war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Whatever the quality of leadership, that is just too big and too dangerous. But so I'm challenging partly your analysis, but I do think this division and the inflaming of it is destabilizing the whole region and the wider Muslim world and distracting everyone from getting progress on human rights, the values of the Arab Spring, Israel-Palestine. And it's really divide and rule that is holding back the region. I'm interested in your response because that is my analysis. And if so, what should the Western policy be? Can we ever hope for a day when we stand up for international law and human rights in the region?
Whether or not that the developing, what do we call it, a confrontation, as I said, which has spawned the little wars there and elsewhere around the world, develops into something greater. We don't know. But the policy should be the same either way. The reality is it is not in the West's interest. It's not in anybody's interest to stoke up this confrontation because it's already led to enough blood. And unless we can come to some kind of understanding, then I think it's only bound to do more. So you're right, in either case. By the way, it may or may not happen. But I do draw you, and again, please, I'm not a believer in historical determinism. The fact that there are certain similarities between what occurred in the Balkans does not need me to say that that's going to happen. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying we should remember that those interconnections exactly existed in the Balkans. Nobody wanted to go to war in the Balkans. But one event led to another, and those piles of tinder ignited into a wider conflagration. And frankly, with these two nations now eyeball to eyeball, is that too strong a word? Probably it is just. But nevertheless, it would not take much for some inadvertent event to lead to a consequence which you are entered into a series of events, each of which feed on each other. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm just saying the higher the height of this tension, and it's pretty high now, take a look at what's happening in Lebanon, the more likely that some mistake, some misaction inadvertently leads to something much more. And I think it's important that we should recognize that. But whether it does or whether it doesn't, there's enough conflict in the Middle East driven by this confrontation for us to know that the time has come, if we can do it, to put it to bed. And I think the actions of the West in this matter are extremely blind so far. I've been warning about this for 4 years now. I was saying it was inevitable that Russia would come in on the side of Tehran. There was an opportunity 4 years ago to build some wider framework within which you could have solved the problems of Syria and Iraq more adequately. That moment may well have passed or nearly passed. But let's at least not let it pass without some attempt to do something more sensible than we're doing at the moment. Sir, I'm interested in taking a woman if one has got a view. Ma'am. Can I take this, sir? And I promise I'll come back to you. I can't be too long, so I'll try and make a bit shorter answer.
Bahia Mardini, journalist. I want to thank you very much. I want to ask if you, Saudi Arabia, how you avoid the Sunni-Shia war if someone threw or Iran threw rocket on your country? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The answer is that one of the things that real statesmen do is they don't respond to a provocation. One of Israel's real problems is they cannot resist responding to any provocation. The moment you respond to a provocation, then you are doing your enemy's business, not your own. But look, precisely because things are so tensions are so heightened, it would mean an event like that. And it could lead, one understands the domestic pressures under those circumstances. It could lead to something wider. The important thing is to try and take the temperature down so that that is less likely to happen. I take the case, if I may, of Bosnia. Forgive me for coming back to Bosnia, but, tensions are rising there too. Does it mean people want to go back to war? Absolutely not. I don't think there's an instinct for war in Bosnia, but I can't tell you, in the tensions as high as they are, what would happen if on a Friday night prayers a hand grenade is thrown into the mosque in Doboj in Bosnia, because events get out of control. So if we are at a point where that circumstance, somebody throws a rocket at somebody else, is likely, then tension is already too high, and it's really important we take that down very fast. Sir, it'll have to be my last, ladies and gentlemen. Please forgive me. I wish I could stay with you. It turns out to be, I think, a fascinating conference. I'd very much like to hear others. But first of all, the gentleman over here. Forgive me, sir. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed Mutayidun, and my question is, if war does break up, what would Britain's response be? Military supply?
I don't know.
Boots on the ground, air power? What do you think?
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I can't speak for the British government. It has long go past my understanding. I don't know why the British government does what it does at all. I mean, they seem to be run by fools and people who are not in touch with the real events of the world. Well, that's popular. I hope you're going to vote Liberal Democrat as well. So the answer is, I don't know. Let me tell you about war. I often hear people coming, and I've seen some war. I've fought in several wars. I often have, what we need now is a revolution. We need to get the arms out. We need to fight for ourselves in the street. Once you launch this event, you lose control. Once you initiate blood, whether in a revolution, you may think you can predict the outcome, but let me tell you, you can't. And so I don't know how Britain would behave in those circumstances. I can just tell you that in those circumstances, I think we'd be on a route to something much wider than the Middle East. And my own view, if I was Foreign Secretary, would be stay out, don't get involved on one side, make sure you continue to act as honest broker seeking to make a resolution of this, and see if you can build the widest possible alliances to make that happen, not excluding, in this instance, Russia, if indeed they will do it. We'll wait to see whether they can. So that's my conclusion, sir. If war breaks out, let me tell you, no one benefits from them, and no one will have control of the outcome, even though they think they may. There's one lady at the back who's very energetic, and since she's a lady, I will take her, but please forgive me if I don't do any more. Ma'am.
Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, can you enlighten us the visit of King Salman to Russia recently?
Say that again, please.
The visit of King Salman to Russia.
The visit of King Salman to Russia, it's a perfectly normal thing for heads of state to visit other heads of state. Russia has made itself, I have to say, largely through our stupidity in the West, a major player in the Middle East, because we did not create an alliance which was possible to deal with the issue of ISIL as it affected them in the Islamic republics in Russia itself. That's a perfectly normal thing for heads of state to visit others. I don't think we should attach any attention, any importance to the fact that he goes there. I'll attach a lot of importance to what he brings back, and I'll wait to see what the result of that is. Thank you all very much. Please forgive me if I have to leave at this occasion.
Thank you, Lord Paddy Ashdown. I wish we could have him longer, but I think he's given us a really wide-reaching speech and set the tone for the sessions and the panel sessions that's to come. If I could ask the first panelist to take their seats, and I'll introduce the chair, Victoria Britton. She's always really gracious in her cooperation with Memo. Victoria, as you know, is an author and a journalist, and she's a former editor of The Guardian. So I'm really delighted to have Victoria with us today. She'll be chairing the session and introduce our first three guests. So probably 2 minutes, so stretch, do what you need to do, but we'll start in about 2 minutes, sort the sound systems out.
I think it's on, yes. Yes, they're in that order, don't worry. So good morning, everybody. I think we have now a panel which is of such breadth and depth of knowledge. We're very far from the Western perspective that Lord Paddy Ashdown said that he was speaking from. And I think we will have in this session exactly what Dr. Dowd was saying, that we would have a new understanding of the situation. We have a Saudi, Yemeni, and a former French official in the intelligence part of the Defense Ministry. All of them are writers, and all of them have fantastic biographies which you can read in your program, so I won't go into them. They're going to speak, each of them, for 15 minutes. All of them have PowerPoints, and at the end they'll take questions, and we'll take them in the order that they're in the program. So we're going to start with Madawi, professor from LSE, and I think everybody in the room knows her because she's, luckily, an excellent presence constantly on our TVs and in lots of things that we read. So thank you very much. If you'd like to start. Yeah.
Thank you, Victoria, for this introduction, and I would like to thank Memo for organizing this event, which is very, very timely given the upheavals that are taking place in the region in general, and in which Saudi Arabia takes part in that. My presentation is going to be brief. I hope I'll give you enough material to understand what's going on. The title is The Kingdom from Multiple Fiefdoms to One-Man Absolute Monarchy. And the title should allow us to understand or capture the transformation that has taken place in Saudi Arabia, not since MBS had taken power, but it was a gradual process. So I will start with giving you background on the domestic issues, because I do believe that any regional policy or international policy is a reflection of domestic issues. All governments, some of you may have studied politics, and you will find that quite a lot of the international or regional policies a government takes is directly linked to its domestic concerns. So from the Saudi perspective, the domestic scene doesn't look very, very promising. Saudi Arabia had moved from being an absolute monarchy that consists of multiple fiefdoms to one absolute king. And this started with the era of Salman and his son. Everybody talks about the Saudi monarchy as a tribal monarchy or as a Bedouin kingdom. Nothing is far from the reality of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had been ruled by multiple fiefdoms, and by which I mean the multiple senior princes that had actually accumulated so much power and wealth and worked as a result of a familial consensus. So the multiple fiefdoms started emerging in the 1970s with the rule of King Faisal. But after he was assassinated in 1975, and under the rule of King Khalid first and then Fahd and Abdullah, we see a new pattern of an absolute monarchy that has to share with very powerful senior princes. So each prince, each descendant of the main founder of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz, managed to establish himself and embed himself in a ministry. So we have the Ministry of Interior, which was the fiefdom of the Al Nayef clan. We have the governor of Riyadh, Salman, who controls a large population. Remember, Saudi population is moving more towards urbanism, and there are more people living in the capital than anywhere else in the Arabian Peninsula. So we have the Al Salman fiefdom. Then we used to have the Al Sultan fiefdom that controlled the Ministry of Defense, and so on. So this kind of situation persisted and continued to be a constant feature of Saudi Arabia, although we had a king. So the last king, King Abdullah, was basically one among others who controlled quite a lot of wealth and a lot of power. Some of these princes had their power anchored in militia, I would call it. Sometimes it's called the National Guard, or sometimes it's called the army. But loyalty of the armed forces, the police and the security forces, were always directed and controlled by a prince. And there's a history why this has happened historically. We could talk about that later. So with Salman arriving into the throne, he was able to sideline all these fiefdoms and concentrate power in his hand and that of his son, Mohammed bin Salman. He was even able to remove and marginalize the prince who controlled the Ministry of Interior, Mohammed bin Naif. At the same time, only weeks ago, he was able to sideline the head of the Saudi Arabian National Guard, Prince Mut'ab bin Abdullah, who was a descendant and a rival. He was a descendant of the previous king, King Abdullah, but also a rival, simply because he had his power anchored in a military force, the Saudi Arabian National Guard. So Salman was able to do that. One would ask, how come he was able to do that? Several factors helped him. First, the aging princes who are his own generation, his own brothers, are limited now. They're almost all of them are either incapacitated or very old. So no Saudi king had ever managed to put succession in his own line of descent and follow a European model of primogeniture. So except Salman, simply because his brothers are no longer there. Every time a Saudi king came to the throne, he tried to do exactly what Salman wanted to do. King Saud in the 50s wanted to do exactly that, but he was prevented from doing this by his by his brother King Faisal, who basically got rid of him, did a coup, and forced him to abdicate, and he became the king. But King Salman was in a way lucky to be able to do that because there were no competitors from his own generation. However, he had to deal with competitors from the second generation. But Mohammed bin Salman was appointed to so many positions in government. He was the minister. He was initially the deputy crown prince. Then he was promoted to crown prince. He became the minister of defense. He became in charge of the economy. He became in charge of the intelligence services. Basically, nobody in the history of Saudi Arabia amassed so much power and control over institutions like Mohammed bin Salman was able to do. So the succession to the throne became followed from now on, we believe, unless there are upheavals in the future, this kind of from father to son. And it will probably continue to be so unless there are challenges in the future. So he did that by eliminating the rival cousins, who are much older than him and probably more experienced. But at the same time, he also marginalized his own half-brothers, who are given jobs in the Saudi government, but not as powerful as the young son of King Salman. And I don't want to go into like the father-son relationship when you have an aging father who endears his last little boy. And in Arab culture, I'm sure you all know what the importance of the little boy for an old aging man. So now, after doing that, installing himself in power, he started what is called the Anti-Corruption Purges. And of course, this is a great PR initiative, because all of us, including us in this room, we'd love to see those corrupt people behind bars. But his anti-corruption purges take place in an opaque kingdom with no freedom of expression, with no independent judiciary. And this is extremely important. So those of you who are journalists, before you hail these reforms as the greatest reforms in Saudi history, please stop and think about the context in which these purges take place. We know dictators could pick few people, put them in jail, accuse them of corruption, and that's a very, very effective populist way of getting rid of your rivals. I'm not saying that those detainees are the ones who were detained recently. There are 11 princes and many others are the sort of the exemplary in honesty and transparency, but without an independent judiciary and without a representative government, it is actually a waste of time. In fact, what Mohammed bin Salman was doing is to change the ancien regime, the old guards, amass them, probably take their wealth because he is in a desperate situation. He needs wealth because of the declining oil prices, in addition to his regional wars that he had been launching since he became important in government. So this kind of anti-corruption purges are hardly what you would expect or what they are. They are an important step to be popular in society and also to appeal to a wider economic audience, the investors in London and Washington who are desperate now to jump on the opportunity and go and benefit from the opening up of the Saudi economy. But in fact, his move had become counterproductive because reports by important newspapers that are interested in investment in Saudi Arabia are saying that investors are having second thought about moving in very quickly and seizing the opportunity of opening the Saudi economy. I'm just going to say something about this hyper-modern post-oil economy that was envisaged by Mohammed bin Salman when he became crown prince, and it is embedded in what is called Vision 2030. And this is basically a blueprint. You could just pick it up from the shelf in IMF or from the management consultancy, McKinsey, and they tried it everywhere. So it's a one recipe for everybody. And in fact, Egypt, before the 2011 uprising, had actually implemented this kind of McKinsey model of how to reform your economy and basically shrink the welfare state and move into privatization and also IPOs of basic government assets. We've had it here in Britain, as far as I remember, and we saw what the high price had become if you want to just get on the tube and go to your university. So the project to create this hyper-modern economy appeals. It's almost like a phantasmagoria, an illusion that everybody is buying in. Not only young Saudis who haven't actually been given the jobs they want, but it is a sort of a glamorous world of technology, modernity, that the society itself is desperate for, thinking that it will get the jobs, especially the youth. Saudi Arabia has one of the highest unemployment of its youth, almost comparable to that in Gaza under occupation. Then there is the project of moderate Islam. The Right Honourable gentleman who spoke before me pointed to extremism and the religious ideology that Saudi Arabia had been involved in propagating, and also here in London. We see them around 2000, I was involved in a research project looking at the export of Saudi Islam to Britain. And I visited some mosques and some cultural centers where, the Saudi Mufti was lecturing the audience about how they should not congratulate non-Muslims during New Year's Eve. It was year 2000, the millennium. They should not actually share their sorrow or joy. And he was referring to a very literal interpretation of certain sections of Islam. And you can just imagine the impact of that on British Muslims, a minority, like other minorities in the country, living in great proximity to non-Muslims. So the reason was given that if you congratulate them during their Christmas celebration, your heart, God forbid, might soften and you start liking them. So this wasn't actually the right fatwa for a multicultural society like the one we live in, but that was tolerated by the British government. Wow. Right, okay, so let me move very quickly. Believe it or not, I have 8 of these presentations, which you will not get a chance to see. But academics are very long-winded. So social change and gender policy. Social change, the interesting aspect of it is that the day the official announcement that women will be in Saudi Arabia will be allowed to drive in 2018, and the government established a committee that will study how they're going to drive. So we are hoping that in 2018, women will be driving. That decision was taken the day before the UN Council on Human Rights was going to meet and was going to ask for independent observers to go to Yemen to check the war crimes that may have been committed by Saudi bombardment over the last 3 years. So all the respectable journalists, from the New York Times to The Guardian to other respectable media outlets in the West, were hailing the decision to drive that was given to women in the 21st century as the last reform that we, Saudi women, could aspire to have. When I was asked to discuss this in the media, everybody was surprised that I had a different opinion. My opinion is that it is used, the driving ban, as a pretext to hold Saudi society in the past and show the world, mainly the West, how backward we are as Saudis because we are a conservative tribal society. The foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, successive ones, had always said that we don't rush us into giving women the right to drive because we are a tribal conservative society. But this suddenly has changed, and then we moved from being conservative tribal society to being to welcoming the right to drive. But these kind of autocratic regimes, they use gender issues, they use women issues in order to project a soft face. And since the women driving ban was lifted, Mohammed bin Salman and the rest of the Saudi government are great reformers because they have played this game elsewhere and probably learned from them. Believe it or not, Hosni Mubarak was a great supporter of women's rights. His wife, Suzanne Mubarak, was a great supporter of women's rights. Zain al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia was a great supporter of women's rights. So basically there is, and I argued this in other publications, there is a certain intimate connection between autocrats and women. And as academics, we have to deconstruct that relationship so that they do not appropriate our causes for their own benefit. We need to be aware how our gender issues are used by these autocrats, unelected, unrepresentative people, in order to show the world their soft face. They need that velvet glove. And remember, if you go on television and watch how many Arab dictators have women communication officers, the Saudi embassy appointed a woman in DC to be the communication officer of the embassy. Because, of course, if you have a pretty woman falling into that kind of trap of the pretty women, nobody's going to challenge you other than having an ugly one with a long beard, which Saudi Arabia had before. Then they shifted from that and thought that now we have a new face to show the world. We have our pretty women to show the world. So be aware not to be really taken by these kind of media and PR exercises that want us to believe that the regime has actually changed. Nothing has changed. All we have seen is a concentration of power in the hand of one man and a purge on the ancien regime. It's to pave the way for the arrival of a new elite that would appropriate the resources, is under no obligation to explain its budget, to explain its corruption to anybody. Thank you for listening, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to.
You'll have a chance to question her more at the end. That was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Pierre. Now, from that incredible tour d'horizon, we now move to Dr. Pierre Conessa. And his, the sort of center of his presentation is going to be about the identity of the regime, particularly the contradictions in the religious aspects. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, because you're taking a risk. I'm Frenchman, so English is not my mother language. So if you don't understand what I mean, it's not because my analysis is not great. It's because my accent is bad and my English is worse. But let's try. May I have a glass of water, please? The first, just some geopolitical aspect of the question. The Najd region in which Wahhabism was born has been a very isolated region which has never been touched by colonization, neither Ottoman colonization nor English colonization, which means that for the Wahhabis, I mean for Abdel Wahhab, the true Islam was the one which has never been touched by modern influence. It was considering that the true Islam, the Islam of the Salaf, was exactly the practicing of Islam of the isolated Najd, the pure Islam. So as soon as the kingdom has been created in 1932, the clerics of Saudi Arabia asked first to propagate Islam, I mean the Wahhabi version of Islam. Second point, to use the terms of Salafism and not Wahhabism, because it would be considered as, in a way, Abdel Wahhab as a saint, if you were to compare. No, it was Salafism, exactly the way to live as Salaf, the companion of the Prophet. And the third point, to force local Shias to convert to Sunnism. That was the 3 points which was imposed by the clerics at the foundation of the region. So you remember that the conquest of the peninsula was made in 3 steps, but the interesting aspect of the religious aspect of the question was that, in fact, in the first step, Abdel Wahhab used the term of jihad to fight against other tribes of the peninsula and to fight against Ottoman Empire, which means that it was not exactly the meaning of jihad to fight against non-Muslims. It was the use of jihad to fight against Muslims. And in fact, I must conclude that jihad is, in a way, in the DNA of the regime, because your pupils are listening this history. It belongs to the Saudi identity, national identity. Third point, all the kings have been taught in the Wahhabi madrasa. None have attended a foreign university, even Mohammed bin Salman, which appeared as a modernist. In fact, he had just studied in the Islamic University of Riyadh, which means I would meet the professor, which tried to put bad notes in the exam. So they don't have, I might say, contact with foreign culture. It's a difference between this Saudi dynasty and the rest of the peninsula. For example, in Qatar, Tamim has done the Sandhurst University, the military Sandhurst University. The same for the Emirates prince, and the same for other rulers of the peninsula. But in Saudi, it's exactly a pure product of madrasa of the kingdom. So we have to notice that, in fact, the regime has 2 legs, 2 arms. The first one is the Saud dynasty, which everybody knows. We explained what's the rules between them, the way to transmit the power, etc. But the other leg, the other arm, which seems very important for me, is the Al-Sher family. The Al-Sher family are the descendants of Abdel Wahhab. And here, it's in French, but probably we'll understand it, that all the power of the family of the great Mufti. Because you have the libraries, you have the High Council of World Muslim League, you have the presidents of the University, Islamic University of Medina, in which I will come back, president of the different institutes of religious science, but also judiciary. You have also library, you have also university, you have also magistrates, education of women, foundation, etc., etc. And that's very important to understand that, because in fact, in a way, the implementation of the religious diplomatic system of Saudi Arabia, you have to understand with this characteristic of the Saudi system. Because in the first historic steps of this system was the fight against Nasser. Why? Because Nasser was a leader of Pan-Arabism, Pan-Arabism ideology, and he was a great leader in the 50s and 60s. And Nasser was very critical regarding the power in the peninsula. So the first reaction of the Saudi kingdom was mainly to build an opposite system to the one of Nasser. For example, to respond to Arab League, the Saudi created the World Muslim League in '62. To face, the Al-Azhar University, they create the Islamic University of Medina in '61. To respond to Pan-Arabism, they use the concept of Pan-Islamism. And King Fahd used to say, I am not an Arab leader, I am a Muslim leader. And that's very important to understand that, in fact, just the first step was mainly to face, the modern aspect of the Pan-Arabism, and just remember that Nasser was regarded by Western power in that time as an enemy. The second step, which is important to understand, is the oil crisis during what the huge wealth of Saudi Arabia, and the concept was modernization without change, which means that a lot of foreign companies arrive, to build defense systems, security systems, buildings, routes, etc., etc. But in fact, the background of the Al-Sheikh family was resisting to that modernization. They were opposed, for example, to the cinema, opposed to TV, etc., etc. And in fact, the crisis of 1971, one of the most important crises was the occupation of Mecca by some more conservative students of the great Mufti, of Ibn Baz, who was a Mufti at that time. So the year 1979 was a very difficult moment for Saudi Arabia, because in February there was a revolution in Iran, which means that for the first time the Shia appears in history. Just remember that with the Shah, it was no question of Shia in the identity of Iran. It was just the big brother of the region. So with Khomeini asking, for example, to manage the holy places by a collective meeting of Muslims, it was, in a way, an earthquake for the Saud dynasty. The second event was the occupation of a great mosque in Mecca by the most traditional students of the Ibn Baz, the great Mufti, and they were denouncing, this modernization of Saudi Arabia society. And the last point was by lucky chance for Saudi Arabia, because it was the occupation of Afghanistan by Soviet army, which means that they can expel, a lot of people, disturbing young students in Afghanistan to fight against Soviet army. So, this 79 year was very interesting also for you to pay attention to one fact which became contradiction of the system. Sorry. When the dynasty needs Western armies' help to save the thrones, it needs also balanced approval from the clerics, because he has to explain that he used a misbeliever, to help him, etc. And usually the Wahhabi hierarchy is providing very interesting arguments, using sometimes very imaginative interpretation of Quran just to justify that it was necessary to help American soldiers. But in exchange, the Saudi are obliged, to give more power to the clerics. And for example, after the Gulf in 1991, 92, all the cinemas rooms of Riyadh has been closed. What's the report? I don't know exactly, except the fact that, in fact, it was the hand of the clerics on all aspects of the Saudi society. One of the girl I was working with for my book explained that when she was young, 30 years ago, she used to go in Saudi Arabia without any veil, with uncovered arms, etc. But now she is obliged to, which means that, the hand of the clerics on all aspects of the Saudi society has been strengthened each time the dynasty is asking for Western help. So, method and organization. One of the interesting instruments of religious diplomacy is the World Muslim League, which has been created in 1972. The methods are the same everywhere. Founding mosque, for example, I was in Central Asia 2 weeks ago, and in all the former Soviet Union republics of Central Asia, Saudi Arabia, through the World Muslim League, has funded more than 2,000 mosques in the region. But the local Islam is very different of Wahhabism, so it's not really a successful campaign, but it's very interesting to notice the figures. With a side close to the mosque, you have a madrasa with special teaching, the Wahhabi version all over the world. Next step, they select the most interesting students to send them to Islamic University of Medina. And when you look at the figures, we think that the University of Medina has trained more than 30,000 foreign students, who are obliged to return to their country. They can't ask for the Saudi passport. That's different. The Saudi are talking about Ummah, but not without the passport. That's different. And they are obliged, it's at the contract. They have a scholarship with the contract, and they are obliged to go back to their country to become preachers. Preachers, always Arabic version. So, for you but I will let you the slide. We have a very interesting former alumni. I'm quoting a very long list of former alumni of the University of Medina. One of the most interesting for us, because the other one are more concerned with Germany and with the other European country. Mohamed Diko is the head of High Islamic Council of Mali. He's the former student of Medina University. And he refused to condemn the Radisson Blu attack hotel, which occurred in Mali in November in 2015, explaining it was a responsibility of colonialism and probably also of gay people. I don't understand exactly what explanation he makes, the contact he makes between the attack of Radisson Blu and gay people, but he used this explanation. Other example of alumni which are very interesting. Pierre Vogel is a preacher in Germany who explained that he criticized the woman which has been raped because he accused her to be Islamophobia. Muhammad al-Maghrawi was a Moroccan Salafi theologian, is a refugee in Saudi Arabia. His fatwa allows the girl to marry at 9, quoting the example of the Prophet. So, yeah, that's finished, that's the conclusion. Some facts, just for you to keep in mind. Saudi combatant has been the most important contingent since foreign fighters during the Afghan wars against Soviet Union. They were the most important contingents with Daesh for a long time, 2,050, 500, today overpassed by Tunisian. 15 out of 19 attackers of 9/11 terrorist attack were Saudi, not North Korean, as it was explained by George W. Bush. And now Saudi is not fighting against Daesh, against the Islamic State, is competing with Daesh. That's why he fights against Yemen. He's using his arm against Shias. For example, in the coalition against Daesh, Saudi Arabia sent 17 combat aircraft. When they decide to invade Yemen, they retired, they get back, the 17th combat aircraft, and they deploy 100 combat aircraft against Yemen. So I think that there are probably an explanation of that attitude. That's my conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pierre. I think that was a great follow-on into the religious contradiction, which was so beautifully brought out, following on from the previous speaker. Now, our third speaker is Professor Ahmed Al-Dubai, who is a Yemeni, as I said, and I think that for this session, to move from the two aspects we've looked at into the terrible, terrible crisis of Yemen, and to hear that spoken of by a Yemeni is a wonderful other aspect for this morning. So thank you very much, Ahmed.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. What I'm going to talk is first about the relations between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. I would like to point out some key points here to understand the deep problem that takes place at the moment in Yemen. I believe that the key or the source of the problem is the nature of the relation between the two countries, between Saudi and Yemen. So these are the key elements here. I would like to do my best to introduce all of these elements, despite the fact that I have 15 minutes anyway. So I will start with the key relations between the Yemen and Saudi, then how that relation was managed so far, then turning points, Arab coalition, Saudi and the Yemeni Spring, the Yemen humanitarian crisis, and then the conclusion. Okay. So to start is actually the main issues had started in started 70, 80 years ago between the two regimes, the two kingdoms. So Al Saud in the north and Al Hamiduddin in the south, conflicting for ages at that time. Then, after that, you see, these are the key destinations. In 62 to 70, there was Saudi support to the monarchy system, despite the fact that the people in Yemen has decided to make it a republic in Yemen. Then, the problems between the south and the north, the influence of the Saudi was not that positive. And then the Gulf Operation Council which excluded the Yemeni people, was that a very turning point or very important point at that time, because the Yemeni felt isolated, and they couldn't manage to have, let's say, partnership between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, but rather it was dependency relation. So in the Yemen unification in 1990, also the Saudi regime was not that pleasant with that unification. Saudi and democracy in Yemen also a key element there. So we saw that Saudi is always close to tribes rather than parties. And the Yemeni civil war in 1994, also Saudis, they supported the separations at that time. Till we have the border agreement in 2000, and then the Arab Spring in 2011. So these are the key issues here, or the key destinations that form this type of relation. In conclusion, I can say that there is no mutual trust between the two countries before the 2011. Tribalism-based relation, not state to state or peer to peer. Saudi used to re-engineer actually the republic regime in Yemen according to its standards. We have very strange republic in Yemen, to be honest. Unequal relation, and we are paying too much price, for this unequal relation. Lack of strategic visions also was the key issue here. Yemen actually, or Saudi, actually they used to manage Yemen by, not as I said, peer-to-peer relation, but by using a special committee. This special committee is very strange. This special committee has created around over 20,000 agents in Yemen, peasant tribes, army, and key figures in Yemen, to rule the country instead of the government. So this is the key point here. And instead of helping Yemen to have a successful state, they used to treat Yemen in this way for ages. This committee is influential in both the tribe and the army. The mission was to keep Yemen under the Saudi custody, to enhance the weakness of the state and form a bad democratic model in the region. To say to the people in the region who is interested to have democracy, this is the ugly model in Yemen. To keep the future of Yemen in the Saudis' hands, the Saudi government. By the way, we are not the enemy of the Saudi people, and not the enemy of the Saudi government as well in Yemen. What we are looking for is to have partnership, to have mutual trust. So the key turning points I'd like to address here, the displeasure from the Saudi displeasure from the Yemeni unification in 1990, then the reaction to that, to Yemen position in the Gulf War in 1991. A new aggressive chapter then began after that. Yemen's policy increased and since the Saudis who terminated their economic assistance to the Yemeni people at that time. By the way, we are not in need for any help in Yemen at that time. Just we need to have a good relation with the region. That's all. I do believe that Yemen is not that poor country. Yemen has a lot of resources and has a great potential to grow, but we didn't get that chance to grow. Saudi at that time expect 1 million Yemeni workers who were resigned in the kingdom in 1990. And then Saudi supported the separation of Yemen at that time. So these are the key elements or the key points till we reach the date of or the Arab Spring in 2011. At that time, it was shocking in the region to have a revolution in Yemen. And Saudis, they played very careful rule at that time. They found millions of people against the regime, against the President Ali Abdullah Saleh at that time. And they introduced an initiative at that time, as you know, and that initiative actually was able to recycle the Saleh regime and turn the youth revolution into a crisis. So this is the most dangerous point here. So we became, from that time, to talk about crisis in Yemen, not revolution. And we demolished the revolution from the dictionary at that time, you see. So then Saudi and United Arab Emirates, they came and have more influence in the Yemeni perspectives in all matters, to be honest. They tried to have here a very strange game to help at that time, at the beginning, to help Houthis to control Sana'a, on the basis of that to fight the Muslim Brotherhood or Islah Party at that time. You see. So, however, the Houthis militias followed the Iranian advice instead. And I'd like here just to say, it is like the Taliban style. It started as a small group, then after that, out of the control of the Pakistan and the region as well. So, both countries here then took advantage of the government weaknesses to format the country. I'm a computer scientist, and format maybe is the best here. What they'd like to do is actually to produce a new Yemen, a new strange Yemen, according to their standards. Saudi and Iran in Yemen. This is the most critical point. You would believe me that if I say the problem started with two students in Yemen. One called Muqbal bin Hadi al-Wadi'i in 1993. He died in 2001. Salafism, Sunni, and Hussein Badruddin al-Houthi. The first one to Saudi, the second one to Iran. And they came together to Sada and couldn't cope and couldn't coexist. By the way, we are in Yemen, Sunni, Shi'i live for over 1,000 years, peacefully. We have no problem at all. At all. And these two guys, they started to have this problem and to work as proxies for both sides. You see, by the way, at the moment even that, it's not sectarian fight in Yemen, by the way. It's not sectarian fight at all. Even those who are fighting with Houthis, there is Sunnis as well. And this is good news. We are not fighting based on sectarian reasons. We are fighting for other reasons I'm going to talk about. As I said here, both couldn't coexist, and then the problem started to grow in this region inside. In 2014, unfortunately, Houthis, as I said, by the support in the beginning of Saudi Arabia, they took over Sana'a and the capital, and they are, as you see, from the same group of the previous monarchy, system in Yemen. And they came here from the Zaydis, who believe that only descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, the cousin and the son-in-law, Ali, have the right to lead the Muslim community as imams. So it is the Iranian, clearly, the same Iranian, perspective here. By the way, not all Zaydis, however, align with the Houthis movement, which is good as well. Then in September they took over, and forced President Hadi to flee Salman. These some crimes committed by the coup. Unfortunately, they are not, at that time, they were not responsible enough to act properly. And they made a lot of mistakes, arrested thousands of people, including journalists, attacked cities and demolished houses and mosques as well, and so on. Then the big question I would like to ask here, why some Arab groups feel closer to more loyal to Iran? This is what we would like to answer, actually. Lack of equality and human rights, lack of visions, absence of democracy and freedom in the region. All of these have contributed to this reason. And then I'd like to talk about the Arab coalition here. It is the military intervention in Yemen, and the Saudis promised that it will be quick in few days or few weeks. Unfortunately, it came to destroy the country. It turned the country to a hell. We are talking about thousands of people killed. We are talking about no vision at all. They came to Yemen with no vision that 30 million people live in that country, and they need support, and also the humanitarian perspectives totally out of the agenda for the coalition. Cholera killed a lot of people. You see here the crisis at the moment, how it became. We are at the moment is the worst crisis in the world because this coalition. Then you see millions of people been affected by this uncalculated, aggression and coalition. It came actually to destroy Yemen completely, and they are not listening to advices at all. We try to send them many messages, they are not listening to us at all. So the challenges now for the Saudis in Yemen, I believe that Saudis trapped themselves in Yemen. The humanitarian crisis is deepened, and also the Saudis and Emiratis at the moment, they are supporting groups, radical groups in Yemen, instead of the government. This is clear in the south, also in the north, to the extent that we lost. Even when I am contacting some ministers in Yemen, they lost. They don't know whether the Saudis, they are supporting them or no, to this extent. So many Yemenis now believe that the ongoing revolution that has started in 2001 is the enemy of that coalition. The emerging democracy was attacked in Yemen. Multi-party system is attacked. You see? Enabling the radical groups like Wahhabism or Madkhali, Salafism, at the expense of the civil society, organization, and parties, weakening the government to control and to have a new, as I said, a new Yemen, according to their standards. These are the key challenges now in Yemen, for the Saudis in Yemen. To be honest, we got a lot of messages that they would like to get out from this situation, but I don't know at what price. So I think now Saudi Arabia has many challenges in terms of, we know that they transfer the power over 2 generations, and economic pressure as well, and oil prices, unemployment, which is like Gaza, as my colleagues said. So all of these together led to the nervousness of the Saudi Arabia. So it is so nervous at the moment. These all challenges need actually very clever leadership, impact from public opinions, which is not the case in Saudi Arabia. So here I would like to see also to say that the future of Saudi Arabia, or a key element for making or for forming the future of Saudi Arabia, is cooked in Yemen at the moment, on these spaces here. So I do like, this is my end slide, by the way. And to have strategic solutions, we'd like to get out from this mess. Successful and strong state in Yemen is the key issue. You see, democratizing the region, as long as we have no democracy in the Arab Peninsula, we will stay as we are, fighting tribes, fighting for ages and ages. I think the first step could be like the Kuwaiti model in Saudi and in the Gulf. They have parliament, they have democracy, and so on, and Yemen as well. And they will, I think, if the West is going just to have a relation based on bargains with the Saudis and the Gulf, I think this is the disaster for the West and the Gulf and all people in the world. Mutual trust and respect in the countries in the region. Good education is the key element as well. Those who are fighting with the Houthis have no skills, have no education, and we are talking about hundreds of thousands now. We need radical solutions. We need new solutions to give them hope. We need hope for the Yemeni people to enable them to engage with the economy, to produce, and to stop fighting each other. Freedom and knowledge-based economy. That region is based on the oil prices. The oil prices is good. The Saudi mood is good. They will behave. The oil prices is not good. We are the victim. You know that the first war in the Gulf was oil prices, based on oil prices. Saudi, Kuwaiti, and so on. Now, the same situation. This country is nervous. They have no alternatives, resources. They base on oil prices, you see. So, at the expense of the Yemeni blood. Integration instead of isolation. Yemen is isolated in that region for ages. And yet, they didn't let us grow in terms of building successful state in the country. In 2011, all the peoples, even the tribes, they came to the capital with the hope of creating a new state, a new hope, democracy, under the umbrella of Arab Spring. And the reaction of the Gulf states, the rich Gulf states, was the reason behind this mess in Yemen at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. Can't possibly leave after that tour de force. Yes, I can see a forest of hands, which I was rather expecting. And we have 15 minutes. So if you agree, we'll take 3 questions together, and then one or other will answer, and then we'll take another 3. Is that okay with everybody? Yeah? I think I would take anyone who's spoken before immediately, because there are now so many hands. Can I take 1, 2, and the lady in the middle? So who's to start? Then I'll come to this side. Who was 1?
Hi, Dr. Shadi Basura from Al-Rashid Center, Aden, South Yemen. My question to both Ahmed al-Dubai and Professor Ahmed al-Dubai and Professor Madawi al-Rashid. So with this crisis now, because of the proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which I call it as unnecessary in Yemen, do you think this crisis in Saudi Arabia will actually ease the war there? Or how would Yemen benefit from this crisis? And what if this crisis actually result into the collapse of the regime in Saudi Arabia. Is this a good thing for Yemen or bad? What do you think?
Hi, I'm Dania Akkad with Middle East Eye. I hope it's okay if I ask a two-part question because my neighbor here has a question, so he's tacking it onto mine. My question is for Professor Rashid. You talked about a new elite coming to power under MBS. Who is this new elite? Who would be crown prince under MBS? And what of these princes and business people who have been arrested and tortured? Will they be held in check by the assets that they're hoping to get back? Are they going to seek revenge? What happens in the coming months? The question of my neighbor is for Professor Al-Dubai. What is Hadi's status in Riyadh? Is he being held, prisoner? Is he being held prisoner?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to, first of all, thank all the panelists and also thank especially Dr. Madawi for what you said. May God bless you for every word you utter. It is really not a question, but rather a comment. Just to reiterate that Mohammed bin Salman is not a reformer. He is unpredictable, adventurous, an intelligent person. And if he was sincere in reforming, he wouldn't do these cosmetic changes. Because let me tell you something, women driving is nothing. 70% of Muslim women, of Saudi women are actually unemployed. They can't afford food and water, let alone a car. So let's not fall into that. And if he was sincere reformer, he would call for the freedom of assembly, the freedom of movement, the freedom of speech, to give the people the right of self-determination. And we talked about the crisis between the Shia and the Sunnah, and I truly believe the only way out of this is to give the Shia minority in Saudi their own rights. I've been actually lived most of my life and raised in the eastern region of Saudi. I had Shia friends being Sunni and I was demonized for it, and I can tell you one thing. Yes, all Saudi citizens are being oppressed, but the Shia minority are way oppressed than anyone else. Oil pipelines were running under their houses, yet they didn't have water or electricity.
So I'll just give the panel a chance to reply to any of those bits that they can or want to, but quite briefly because we've got so many other questions. She's mic'd, isn't she? It's not working.
Right, thank you for your questions and comments. I think the proxy war in Yemen now. I just want to reiterate what Professor Ahmed said, that Saudi intervention in Yemen dates back to the 1930s, before there was an Islamic Republic in Iran, before the Sunni-Shia tension and schism at the moment. And there is, if you think in terms of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, think in terms of the US and Mexico. And there is a country that is relatively poorer than Saudi Arabia, shares a wide border with Saudi Arabia. It has the labor that Saudi Arabia lacks. And since the oil boom, Yemenis had been migrating to Saudi Arabia. Thousands of them had become Saudi citizens from different parts of Yemen, from Hadramaut. One of the people who are actually being detained last week, they are Yemeni of Hadramaut, Hadramis, and they had made fortunes in Saudi Arabia. The names come to my mind: Rajhi, Bin Laden's, Bukharis, and there's so many of them. But the majority of Yemenis who went to Saudi Arabia were from rural areas in Yemen. They were unskilled laborers. They were fundamental in in basically the Saudi economy. They were the first immigrants who came to make Saudi Arabia what it is now. But all their work wasn't recognized. And at the first crisis, 1 million of them were kicked out, like Professor Ahmed said. So Today, yes, we see that it's a proxy war. But when the Yemeni, the Houthis, one thing we don't understand, the Houthis are Zaydis and the Iranians are Ithna Asharis. And there is a big gap between them. The Yemeni Houthis are closer to the Sunnis than to the Ithna Ashari Shiites. And we don't understand that. Their theology is closer to us in Saudi Arabia. And Shokani, one of their greatest alim, he's revered by the Saudis. So I think the problem in Yemen, we fail to see, we have to go beyond the sectarian dimension to understand why Saudi Arabia has always interfered in Yemen. It has always interfered in Yemen because it fears Yemen. It wants to thwart any democratic experiment in the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen was one of the first countries to have actually moved towards some kind of democracy. It's not perfect, it's a process. Kuwait is the second one, and Saudi Arabia interferes in Kuwait to thwart the democratic experiment in Kuwait. It is not in the interest of Saudi Arabia to see any democratic experiment succeed in the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. I mean, when the Arab uprising gave us a clear indication how Saudi Arabia and the other monarchies at the time, with the exception of one, and that was Qatar, supported the ancien regime across the board. They hosted Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. Now he's an exile in Saudi Arabia. They pumped money into Egypt to bring back the ancien regime. They have done everything in Bahrain to thwart a democratic, non-sectarian movement that started as a pro-democracy movement and managed to derail it and make it increasingly sectarian. And they also did the same thing in Yemen. So it is not about sectarianism. It's not about Shia, Saudi, Iranian disputes and proxy wars. It is more fundamental than that. And the Crown Prince, we don't know who the Crown Prince will be, Dania. It is impossible to know. It's Mohammed bin Salman's son. He's probably waiting for his son to grow, and he will become the Crown Prince. In terms of, yes, the reform about moderate Islam that we talked about, it is now the Saudi Arabia is presenting itself as the bastion of moderate Islam. Can you just imagine if a kind of moderate Islam, however we define it, had been the center stage in Mecca and Medina? What influence would that have had on the Muslim world in general? But unfortunately, we have the most radical interpretation of Islam becoming the religion of a state that is endowed with petrodollar and spreading its literal interpretation of Islam across the globe, from London to Washington to Detroit, to Jakarta, and everywhere else. But if Mohammed bin Salman is serious about creating moderate Islam, why would he put in prison religious scholars in September who were actually, some of them are moderate? And I give the example of Sheikh Salman al-Ouda, whose most recent opinion on homosexuality is this, that you do not need to prosecute homosexuals now. And this is a person who's been detained without trial since September. We don't know what happened to him.
Thank you very much.
Just 1 minute, but yes, of course, we do care about we do like the Saudi regime at the moment to collapse that. You see, it will be a disaster in the region. I mean, what we are looking now for is the interference from the West to have a new initiative to bring Iran and Saudi to the table. I don't know why this is not taking place so far. I think the West is happy, maybe, to see the conflict between the Saudi and Iran. This is, a lot of people, they say like that. So we need explanation from the West. Why there is no initiatives from the West to have agenda and to bring the Saudis and Iranian to the table? Why now the Saudis, they would like to have discussion with Israel? And they are not interested to have any discussion with Iran. So this is now, we need new politics in the region to re-engineer the politics there. There is no politics in Middle East. There is fight, only fight. Saudis at the moment, they are interested to fold the hand of Iran in Yemen. And Iran, they would like to fold the hand of Saudis in Yemen. And we are bringing paying the price. 30 million. At the moment when I'm talking for 10 minutes, tens of children killed in Yemen. Do you know that?
Thank you very much. Okay, let me go from the furthest to the back there. The bloke with glasses. Then there's a lady here in the middle. That man who's just taken his scarf off. And then the third one is here in the front. Thank you.
But can you keep your questions quite short?
Yeah, sure. I'm Badr Qahtani. I'm a Saudi journalist in London, and I'm pro-Saudi government. And I just wanted to make a point. Why we didn't see any Saudi side opinion here? Why we only like, I'm a citizen now. I'm not representing anyone. Why we didn't hear this kind of voices here? And why this sessions wasn't like objective? So this is my point. And there is a lot of mistakes have been here. I don't want to comment each by each, but this is my question. Why we didn't see the pro-Saudi government opinion in this place? Thank you.
I think I'll just answer that question because it's not appropriate to give it to our speakers because they were not involved in the organizing of this, and nor in fact was I. So perhaps you would talk to people at Middle East Monitor afterwards and have a discussion with Dr. Daoud, I would suggest.
Swadika Hassan, international artist, international relations. A question to Professor Madawi al-Rashid. Can you please explain the tension going on in Riyadh about these princes and these businesses being prisoned in the hotel? Thank you.
Dr. Jalal Fayrouz, I'm member of Parliament, formerly member of Parliament Bahrain. I'd like to raise just a short question to Dr. Ahmed and Professor Pierre. Dr. Ahmed, what should be done to stop selling the British arms to the clones and Saudis, dropping them on the women and children in Yemen? What have you done? What can everyone do to stop that? Okay, that's a question. Pierre, you mentioned all the Salafist Wahhabis being imported into all over the world and including Europe. You know, and just in London, over 90 mosques are being operated by the Saudi embassy. And if you dare to go inside there and you are not Muslim, you will have it. And also in Paris, you know, what have the governments done to stop? Because all the terrorist attacks, all of them have been originated from these Saudi-operated mosques. What have been done? Thank you very much.
Okay. As we didn't get a third question, the two rows behind.
Thank you. My name is Kamil Hawash. I'm a Palestinian academic. So it is a question related to the Palestinian issue, if I may, to Dr. Madawi. And just to keep it short, can she see in the next 2 or 3 years the Israeli flag flying in Riyadh?
So Pierre, why did you take the question?
Okay. Yes, two questions because I hide it, but I used to work a lot of time in the arms exports for French Ministry of Defense. That's the way by which I had to visit, Saudi Arabia. So your question is very important because, in fact, never can stop the export of arms export because it's a big customer. In average, Saudi Arabia is the best customer for French arms export for the last 20 or 30 years. As I was explaining, Saudi Arabia is spending the same amount for religious diplomacy and for arms import. Well, so, but in a way, the campaign against bribery is very interesting because, in fact, if we put in jail a guy of the Sultan branch of the Saudi family. The Sultan were in charge of all arms contracts for the last 40 years, which means that if they ask them to talk about, all the foreign Western company will be concerned. I just take an example which is directly tied to Great Britain. The Yamama export contract was the biggest for the last 30 years, and in a way it was a rescue position for British aerospace. We think that the amount of bribery is around 30% of the amount of the contract. And it has been renewed with Yamama 2. The first one was to buy for Tornado aircraft, combat aircraft, and the second one is to buy Eurofighter combat aircraft. And I can quote for you, for example, they arrest also the Chief of Staff of the Navy, and the main projects of the Navy in Saudi Arabia are coming from France. So in a way, this anti-bribery corruption campaign would be very destabilizing in the field of arms exports, which means that if a campaign, opinion campaign, is beginning somewhere in Europe to stop the exports armament in Saudi Arabia, it could succeed because, not because of morality, because the risk that today we are facing after the bribery campaign, which I have to salute, because the day before they implement Anti-Corruption Commission headed by the Prince, and the day after, this arrest 200 people. It's the most efficient anti-bribery commission I see in the world. The other question about Salafism, you're right. I mean, for us in France, the turning point has been the terrorist attack on Charlie Hebdo. For the first time, the Prime Minister, Mr. Valls, used the term of Salafism to design the target. Before, we were mixing, you know, integrist, Muslim integrist, radical Muslim, etc. Never designing the problem. We used, you know, general concept. And that the first point was Salafism. To design Salafism was a speech of Mr. Valls in January 2015. And now we are trying, you know, to stop. We are trying to expel Salafist preacher, etc. One of my friends, Muslim ulema, explaining to me that Salafism, or Wahhabism, as you like, is the most racist, the most anti-Semitic, the most homophobic, the most misogynia, and the most sectarian vision of Islam. So I don't need to read Abdel Wahab text. I just want to stay on political aspect of Salafism. And in France, we have legal terms to expel all these people when they don't have in the United States. We can punish people using anti-Semitic speeches, explaining that gay people must be slaughtered, etc., etc. So we are just beginning that campaign.
Yes, I just want to, the same as Victoria, I'm not the organizer of the conference and had nothing to do with who gets invited, but I have an answer to this question. Why don't we have a pro-Saudi, pro-government voice? It doesn't have to be Saudi. There's so many pundits around London who can speak on behalf of the Saudi. So I'm not bothered about the nationality of the person. But in the same way, I could ask why I can't go to my own country. Why can't I go to a conference they organize in Chatham House? So perhaps when I get invited to the Saudi embassy to present or to a conference sponsored by them, we could ask the same question of Memo, why they have no pro-Saudi voices. In terms of what happens to the princes who are detained, I've been asked this question so many times, and I frankly don't care, simply because if you think of like the system imploding from within, this is exactly what happens what is happening now in Saudi Arabia. They're catching each other for their own game, not to benefit me. In the name of anti-corruption, there are certain rivals of the current crown prince are being detained, whether they're corrupt or not. We all know how they got their wealth. Everybody's going on about Al-Walid bin Talal and why is he detained because he's hailed as that Western-educated reformer or the Western-educated entrepreneur. He is the face of the private sector. But how did he get his money? Why is it Walid bin Talal not somebody else? What kind of privilege he had to have that money that he built his financial empire? So basically, it is a battle between princes, and not many Saudis are actually involved in this. They want to eliminate each other. Go ahead. System implodes from within. If Saudi society is weak, and I believe it is weak, it is deprived of the ability to organize itself in civil society. They have undermined all sorts of civic action and prohibited civil resistance. You cannot demonstrate, you cannot write, you cannot tweet. Everything is forbidden at the moment. You can't do that. And if you think they allow Twitter for years to monitor people and catch them if they voice any kind of dissenting opinion. In terms of why the West is selling arms, yes, we've heard it before. Successive British government in the Foreign Office, in the House of Lords, whenever we give talks and we ask them, they say, well, if we don't sell the Saudis arms, then the French would. And this is the competition between multiple Western governments competing for Saudi money. And why they encourage, for example, talks with Israel and not with Iran. But of course, they will encourage talks with Israel and not with Iran, because the Iranian-Arab conflict had been used again and again to sell more arms. If, in fact, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, was founded in early 1980s because of Iran. And because of that, we continue to buy arms because our enemy is Iran. And as long as we have the enemy as Iran, we will continue to buy weapons. In terms of an Israeli flag in Mecca or in Riyadh, well, you don't need to raise the flag to have contacts. I have a report that I could cite by my colleague Christian Ulrichsen. He's documented tatbir, the normalization of relations in the name of security, in the name of economic and transfer of technology, so that you don't need to have the Israeli flag in Riyadh in order to have close connections. And in fact, just yesterday, there was a conference held in Kuwait by the Gulf in order to resist normalization and continue with boycotting Israel. And there had been some success stories with multinationals and corporations with pressure from DBS, the Palestinian organization that encourages boycotting Israeli products. And there is a Gulf branch that is actually working on that. Whether they will succeed, I'm not sure, but at least it means that, you know, these rulers who are doing that do not represent everybody in the Gulf. There are people who are worried and still care about Palestinian rights.
We've run over time, and I know there's a forest of hands over there, but I'm told that we can't take any more. So I'm just going to give Ahmed the moment to just finish. But before I do, I'll just say a quick thank you to all of you for your lovely questions and for our lovely panel. So to Ahmed to finish.
Thank you very much. Maybe this slide is good enough to explain the situation in Yemen, what the Arab coalition did in Yemen. So in addition to that, maybe my final comments is that Yemeni people are asking now the world to help. Because this war, or the Arab coalition, represented by Saudi Arabia and Emirates in particular, took Yemeni people to a motorway with no exits. Horrible motorway with no exits. We are in a situation that the majority of people now in Yemen are suffering from this war in all means. She asked me about Hadi situation in Saudi Arabia. The problem with Saudi Arabia, with the regime there, is they used to have followers rather than partners. And I was in contact with ministers. Even the minister, if you'd like to go outside of the Saudi Arabia, he has to apply for a visa. Do you know that? So there is no respect. they are looking at Hadi as someone was asking for help. Maybe you saw how the Saudi Arabia treated Al-Hariri in Lebanon, yeah. The same situation anyway. So that's why I said in my slides here that we need partnerships. So the final comments here I'd like to say, we can do something here. We have to communicate with our MPs, asking the government to stop selling the weapons, but the Saudis, they can find other weapons. The most important is to have pressure from the West to stop this war and to bring only five people in Yemen, they can sit together and end up this whole story. But there is no real initiatives. They send someone from United Nations, he's gambling. When you are talking to him, he has nothing in mind. He said to stop the war. What's your plan? There is no plans. No real plans. So this is the final point I would like to address. Thank you very much again.
Can I make a very important clarification before we finish for lunch in response to the question posed to Memo by the gentleman over there, why we didn't invite pro-Saudi individuals. We did invite a number of pro-Saudi individuals, including officials from the embassy and also officials from elsewhere, but I think you'll have to ask them why they didn't attend a conference as important as this, so the question is to be thrown back at them. So, enjoy your lunch. We'll break for 45 minutes and return, I think, in 10:45. Yeah, thank you.